Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on achieving compliance with DORA through automated security validation. Before we start, I'd like to quickly jump into our agenda for today to give you a bit of context, and then obviously introduce our speakers for today. So let's start with the agenda itself. So as I mentioned, we're going to start off by introducing my co-host with me here, Matteo. We will be discussing what DORA is, speaking of who needs to comply, speak of the timelines and get a better understanding of what it entails. Matteo is going to actually take us through a very interesting, what we call maturity or adoption model, and see some, some real information on what's actually being and how things are happening across Europe and European wide. Speak of the chapters and how obviously Pentera can help to map those. And at the end, we're going to have a bit of wrap up and potentially some questions that we get as as security practitioners in the field regarding DORA specifically. So before we kick it off, so both Matteo and myself have, very carefully studied the requirements, and what we would like to do in this webinar, kind of our aim is to really address the key topics, the questions, the challenges, and really looking at kind of the recommendations that we sort of envision when we look at DORA and what they mean to financial institutions specifically across the EU and beyond. So as I said, we will start by discussing DORA, explain what it is, why you should care, and obviously why the time now is critical to start thinking about it. Then we will review each of the 5 key pillars, and you'll see that in a few seconds, of the regulations, and then move on to answer some of the questions, as I've said, that we see coming up in discussions with existing customers, with partners, with prospects when they think of DORA and kind of how they envision the whole kind of the journey of becoming DORA compliant. But before we start, my name is Asaf Regev. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Pentera. I have over 20 years experience in product management and product marketing, coming from a technical and engineering background. And it's with really a great pleasure to be hosted or to be joined by Matteo from one of our strategic key partners, Accenture. So welcome, Matteo. Can you give us kind of introduce yourself firstly, and then kind of tell us about your role and kind of the backstory of yourself?
Thanks, Asaf. Hi, everyone, and very happy to be here to discuss this hot topic with you today. My name is Matteo Tecchiato. I am a managing director in Accenture Securities, working in security since 2007, and helping clients to improve their cybersecurity capabilities in Accenture. So very happy to be here to discuss about this topic. I think we have a lot of points to discuss. So please, I give you the stage of the agenda.
Lovely. So let's dive in. So you obviously mentioned, in our discussions together, previously, we've also discussed, the whole notion of DORA, but what does it really mean? Or kind of, give us the backdrop of, who needs to comply, what are the timelines, what would be the impact potentially if they don't comply, and just, kind of help us really to dive into what it really means to, to an existing financial institution, either based out of the EU or, or a larger kind of multinational organization that has branches or has operations or is doing business, kind of globally, but also in the EU.
Yeah, I think that most of our audience today is aligned with the DORA requirement, but we would just to summarize here in one slide the objective of the regulation and who must comply with the new regulation. So first of all, the objective is to improve the cybersecurity capabilities of a financial service institution in order to be resilient against cyber attacks. Let me say that it's a way to standardize the level of cybersecurity posture inside the financial services institutions. Who must comply with DORA? all financial service institutions, not just only banks or insurance company, but also some specific players like working like, for example, payment providers, credit companies, and so on, that are providing critical services inside the financial services institution market. But not only these, also providers that are going to give IT services for critical infrastructure. For example, Accenture also must comply with DORA in some specific legal entities where he provide IT services for financial services.
Excellent. Understood. So one thing to really, and again, because we're coming from different backgrounds, I think we're gonna mention, financial institutions and financial banks and insurance. It's basically kind of the whole compliance, or DORA refers to, these statutes or statures as entities, so financial entities. So we may be making use of, of different kind of names and wording, but that's typically what we mean. So that's really good. But can you, if I kind of move on to the next slide, kind of give us, if you will, the backdrop again of the story of how and when everything started, and when does the hammer kind of fall and everyone has to kind of comply and be aligned with DORA?
Yeah, DORA is a 24 months journey because it has been published at the beginning of January 2023, and gives 24 months for clients and organizations to be compliant. In this period, there were some discussion with the entities, the supervisory authorities of the regulation, in order to discuss some specific technical requirements required by the organization. And we are at the end of the journey, because as you can see in this chart, we are at the end of the first half of 2024. So all technical specifications have already been discussed, and we are waiting for the final report that should be provided by the end of July. So the regulation is pretty clear. All technical discussion has been completed. We are just waiting for the final feedback. And then we have last half of the 2024 to be compliant with DORA. Starting from January 25, DORA must be applied on all financial services institutions.
Yeah, and I think that, and again, it kind of brings me to the initial, kind of even the name itself, kind of speaking of the kind of the digital operationalizing, of the regulatory, or the Resilience Act, if you will. It basically means that what does it really mean? It means that they need to have the systems, the processes, and everything else in place to do what? To identify specific gaps that they have, whether it's, in terms of vulnerabilities or any other kind of security controls that they have. Can you give us a bit more on the kind of the technical depth, or the kind of, what is known as the RTS, or the regulatory technical standards?
Yeah, sure. And then we can jump in the details of the different sections. But to give a feedback to your question, at the beginning of January 25, the financial services institutions must have in place all the capabilities, all the processes that DORA is going to ask. So they must have in place everything that is required by the regulation. They have the chance to in the last half of 2024 to complete some specific points that are have been discussed with the regulator, but it's something that has already addressed. So they need to complete every initiatives and activities in order to have all the requirements in place, processes, tools, and to demonstrate that they are able to be cyber resilient against cyber attacks.
Excellent. Which kind of brings us almost naturally to, to our next slide, which kind of speaks to, just like you said, the kind of the, the maturity, or, or the, where specific organizations are when they, just like you said, when, 18 months ago, when they started, when, when the initial regulatory requirement came into play and all the way to kind of January 17th of 25 of next year, it's really interesting to see the various organizations, and as you'll probably explain in a second, just to give some context on what it is that we're seeing. So there's obviously different organizations coming from different verticals, even though we are speaking of financial entities or financial institutions only, but even that is, very broad in its scope. So what we're seeing here basically is, excuse me, is kind of their maturity in the journey, kind of in that 24, months span. And, can you walk us through to what it is exactly that we're seeing here and give us a better understanding of what it actually means?
Yeah, sure. As Accenture, obviously, we are supporting many clients in order to be compliant with DORA. Here is a selection of our main customers where we are directly involved in these remediation programs. This picture was taken at the end of December 23, so it is 6 months ago. And as you can see, the big players here, because we are speaking about the big banks and also big financial service, big insurance company, started to evaluate, has already performed an assessment in order to identify the gaps between what they have in place and what DORA is going to ask. And for these four main section of the regulation, as you can see, they found that they are pretty good on the section related to the ICT risk management. So what they have already put in place in the past in order to have a framework or risk management is something that is near what is DORA is going to ask. But going in the other section, you can see that there are a lot of amber and red balloons. So, for example, for the incident management, before to read the RTS, these players thought that they were pretty compliant, but looking in the details of the technical specification, they understood that they were not aligned with DORA, so that they have the gap also to put in place in order to be compliant. The same for the third party risk management, because it's something more specific. And looking the details of the regulations, these players have understood that they need to improve their third party risk management program in order to be compliant with the regulation, in order to identify the third party and to understand which kind of processes they are providing to the entities. Finally, resilience testing is something new, because there were not a previous regulation that were going to ask something similar. There is a Tiber EU, but is something different that we're going to detail later. But on this topic, all of players, as you can see by the slide, need to put in place many activities in order to be compliant. So just to summarize, most of the players have already started and are completing the assessment. They have understood where they are well positioned and where they have the main gaps, and they are still working on the remediation plan in order to be compliant by the end of this year.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. And again, we've looked at some of the numbers, and if I remember correctly, there are roughly 22,000-ish financial entities or financial institutions in the EU, which are directly impacted. And obviously, the scope and the ripple effect is much larger when you look at it globally. So you kind of give an example of 6 or 7 institutions, which is good. Which is it's really good to see that organizations have taken this to heart and not just said, okay, we are Tiber EU or Tiber, as a general, or Tiber IT, because I know that it changes, by country, depending on the local regulations or kind of specific additions for local regulations. So it makes a lot of sense that, that some of them, as you mentioned, are already in the green or the amber, but also the other ones, which are net new to DORA, all of a sudden introduce to the organizations. It opens up, a gap of existing controls versus things that they have, versus things or processes or tools that they currently don't have and need to kind of adopt into that in order to be DORA compliant. So before we actually jump on that now that we've sort of, we've set the scene for what DORA is, for who it's relevant for, and why you as a financial entity, need to care, or what you need to abide by. But let's now look at, kind of the chapters. And I think that even though there are, if I remember correctly, there are 9 chapters altogether, we're really looking to focus on, those 5 relevant ones, and those are the really kind of the heavy lifters. Those that financial entities need to really look into depth. So if I kind of, take them from left to right, we start off with, with chapter 2, funnily enough, which is the first one that we kind of look into. So that's basically, I think, the biggest one, and probably the most important one, is kind of, it's called ICT risk management. So we talk about, starting the process with, first of all, understanding and establishing what it is that you need to assess for, as far as risk. And that includes understanding of where critical assets are, and what actually makes, or how you define, a critical asset and what it means, and getting that understanding. Then, or kind of second, we talk about ICT related incident management. Obviously, that speaks of classification and reporting of major cyber threats. So basically, you as an organization are required to speak of, or kind of mention, or kind of be vocal about incidents that happen or occur to your organization, and kind of take the precautionary actions on the basis of that. Then probably one of my favorite, obviously, is the third one. We talk about digital operations resilience testing, and that's really Pentera's bread and butter. It really talks about pen testing, about automation, and pretty much everything in between. And in this one, DORA actually went one step ahead and introduced a new term by the name of TLPT, which kind of stands for, threat-led penetration testing. And I don't want to steal your thunder. We're going to talk about that, in a few more slides. Next up is, kind of management of ICT third-party risk. Just like you mentioned, it's not just about looking internally and saying here where the gaps exist within my organization, but you need to be looking, at the bigger picture, steer and understand and control third-party providers, and what sort of risk they may have, or that may inflict on your organization, and and kind of understanding that frame of reference. And lastly, obviously, talking about information sharing arrangements, which is the cyber threat information sharing. So let's really jump into kind of the meat and potatoes, if you will, Matteo, and then jump into the mapping that you so kindly provided, and see where and how Pentera can kind of jump in, and what are the specific sections that that are relevant to the discussion.
Yeah, first of all, let me summarize that DORA is a very good collection of requirements that were already required by different regulations in the financial service institution, but also from standard and best practice in cybersecurity, like NIST, for example. So here we have tried, then this is the first exercise, to take the detailed requirements that are included in the different section of the regulation, and try to understand how leveraging on a platform like Pentera, but generally leveraging on automation, we can support, we can provide, we can speed up the adoption of these requirements, and we can support the clients to be compliant with the regulations. So this is not exhaustive list, because we are working in the most important from our point of view. As I already mentioned before, the RTS for the last part of RTS are still in review, but this is a good point to start now. So we can go through this list, and we can evaluate and discuss what we have found looking these requirements. So first of all, in the section of ICT risk management, there is a long list of requirements that needs that infrastructure and network must have in place a baseline of security. All systems must be secured by design, by default. You cannot put in production a system without hardening, without a security policy, and so on. So this is the first point. Here we can, and leveraging on a tool like Pentera, obviously it's normal to think to use it to validate this kind of implementations. So you need to put in place some specific security baseline, but you need also to validate them. You need to be sure that these kind of requirements are put in place in your change management process. And how you can do testing your environment, leveraging on a platform that can be able to understand the real level of your security infrastructure. The second part is more specific than network. Network, I think DORA is going to ask a very common network security best practice to segregate a network, to give, for example, to the administration network, just the connectivity to your environment, not to internet, and so on, stuff like that. So you can obviously in this way, in this space, support your team in order to understand if these network policy are really implemented in your environment, and to maintain this policy active in your environment against also the change that your infrastructure could have, and so on. So it's important to have the policy, yes, but also to implement this kind of requirements in your network infrastructure.
Yeah, so it really ties well with, obviously with Pentera's story of, running, just like you said, kind of putting automation into play in order to really validate your controls across real production environments, and then, making sure that it runs continuously, but also at scale, and saying, you don't just look at, a portion of the network, you kind of look at everything, you test and validate everything on a continuous basis. So that makes, really a lot of sense as far as it relates to what Pentera can provide in that space.
Yeah. Also, the same approach can be used in the other sections. For example, there is a specific chapter requiring to protect all the data, all the information that are be moved, are in transmit. So you need to enforce the encryption of this communication. You need to enforce the protection of your data while are in your network, in your communication. So it's against here, you can validate, you can test, you can find if your network, your infrastructure has the right level of security in order to ensure the protection, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, obviously, of your data while are in transit. And not only to the technical part, let me say, we can use a tool like Pentera to test if organizations are DORA compliant. Also in awareness part, for example, it's strictly required to put in place security awareness program, security learning of your IT department, of your employees, and so on. Obviously, you need to ensure that your employees are able to use the right password, the right level of configuration of environment. They are not connecting from different part of the network that are not trusted, and so on. So also here, you can validate, you can test, you can find if all security best practice that you need to require to your workforce are followed, and to identify where you need to improve this awareness program. So, for example, you could have some specific users that are not following some specific rules, and you can improve their training plan.
Yeah, and I think that, oh, sorry, and I think that just like you said, the whole idea is to kind of do this on a continuous basis. So it's not a one and done sort of an assessment. It's not a one and done enablement. It's something that is done continuously to really bring your maturity or minimizing exposure on a continuous basis in order to really, make everyone better, make the whole, financial institution community better, more resilient to threats. So there's a lot of sense in that, in generally speaking, but also in some of the very specific requirements that they put together.
Yeah. Also, if we look at the requirements on the identity and access management space, obviously, as discussed before, you need to have in place some procedures and tools in order to ensure that you are going to assign the right level of permissions and rights to your workforce in line with the least privilege approach. So
yeah.
it's important that your IT department has not a long list of grants that are not managed and so on. And in this way, providing regular testing of your infrastructure or your network, you can find some situations that are not aligned with your policy. And this is required by DORA to be compliant, to enforce this kind of situation. So you need to ensure that your identity and access management platforms or processes are going to give the right level of access to your workforce.
Yeah, and again, I think it's important to note that, you know, maybe different than other regulatory requirements or other testing or other automation tools, this is done on a real production environment. It's not run on a sandbox. It's not run in a QA environment. It's really run on your actual environment. So there's, you know, when you're, and you mentioned that before, obviously everything that you run, you know, needs to be safe. It needs to be safe by design in a means that, you know, it's not going to cause any harm to the network. So there's a lot of, you know, things that you need to kind of keep on the back of your mind when you know, when you start thinking and planning of how you test or how you validate your processes. So that's very interesting as well.
Yeah. Looking at this slide, we move to the detection phase. In particularly, DORA has a specific section related to the incident management. First of all, the objective is to have a standard process for all financial services institutions that are able to manage cyber threats in the same way, with the same level of reporting, with the same approach, and with the same level of management of the cyber threats. And this is a very critical part. Here you need to work on processes and also you need to put in place some specific tools that are able to support your team to provide incident management. How we think that leveraging on a tool, on a platform like Pentera, we can support. Basically, you need to put in place some specific steps in your incident management process, and the DORA is going to require some specific evaluation when there is a security incident and so on. Performing security testing activities in production environment, for example, you can test not only the level of security of your infrastructure, but also you can test the fact that your capabilities, your functions that has the objective to monitor what is going to happen in your environment are able to understand that there is a malicious activity, are able to find some indicators that there is an attack running, and so how they manage this event. So you can, let me say, do a blue team, red team exercise, because you are going to test the real fact that your security operations center, for example, is going to understand that there is a malicious activity inside and that is able to manage following some specific steps in your incident management process.
Basically, what you're saying, it's a cross environmental, cross company sort of a process or operation. It's not just involving the red teams, you know, not just the defensive or just the offensive. It's basically a combination or a cross combination of teams and processes and tools that everyone needs to kind of align with. So that's why it's necessarily, you know, taking this long. If it was just one discipline, it may have been, you know, maybe easier. And that kind of brings me, you know, to the next topic, which is probably, you know, the biggest and kind of the most important one, or the most interesting one, if you ask me, the whole idea of threat-led penetration testing. So you want to kind of, you know, take us through what it means and you know, kind of how you look at it from your perspective?
Yeah. TLPT is, let me say, the very new requirements of DORA against the other regulations. And what is TLPT? TLPT means thread-led penetration testing. It's a sort of adversary simulation activity. So the organization is required to understand which are the real threats that could be affect them. And with the real threats, I mean understand what is going to happen external of your organization, which are the threat actors, which are the tools and techniques that these threat actors are going to use to try to breach your environment and your network, and why they want to breach you. For example, for financial motivation or for other situation that we are going to see now in the world. So first of all, you need to have a phase where you understand your threats, and how you can understand your threats, leveraging on your threat intelligence capabilities. So asking to threat intelligence provider or working with your threat intelligence team to understand what is happening outside your organization and so on. Then you should test your environment against these threats. So you select your threat actors, you select what kind of tools and techniques they adopt, and then you test these techniques against your infrastructure. So you are going to test if your environment is really resilient against a cyber attack. So you are performing an activity, let me say, red teaming phase. Okay, so you are going to evaluate in the real world, in the real life, the level of cybersecurity of your IT applications and so on. And this is an exercise that has a specific methodology that you need to follow. There is some specific timeline to comply, and there are some specific reports to provide. It is required that this kind of exercise has been performed just at least one time in 3 years. It's something similar but more simplified than Tiber framework, but it's similar in terms of approach. Let me say just simplified because there are some specific part of Tiber that is not included. So if we can jump in the following chart, in the following slide, I can see, you can see the details of this phase.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of to get, your understanding. So based on what you see nowadays, based on your experience, because Tiber EU or, Tiber IT or, kind of Tiber as a whole has been around for a while, and that basically speaks to the, the performance of, red teaming exercises and pretty much only on that. So it's, it's a whole framework or a whole kind of process or compliance requirement that puts organizations in that mindset. Yet DORA kind of chose to take it one step further, make it a little more simplified, but it's very focused. So it's a little different. It's it's a bit of a different approach, different mindset. And I'm kind of wondering, kind of if you have, and again, it's a personal thoughts on why they chose to actually go this way rather than saying, you need to have Tiber, as the basis for kind of, testing the resilience or, the penetration testing, but then they chose to kind of go with something different. Why do you think that, they chose to do that?
Against, I think, to standardize the level of cybersecurity. So Tiber is applied to critical infrastructure. So let me say very top players of the financial service institutions.
Correct.
The other players need also to perform a real scenarios of attacks. Performing penetration testing in a test environment is not enough to protect against cyber attacks. So first of all, you need to have a clear understanding of your critical system and critical function. And this point of regulation is also correlated to the first chapter, ICT risk management. So you need to have the clear visibility of your critical infrastructure, or the critical functions and critical application. And then you test, but don't test, let me say, just to understand if your application is following OWASP top 10. You need to test if your entire environment is resilient against the cyber attack, against the real threat actors that you have found working with your intelligence. So it's like connecting the dots, let me say.
Interesting. Okay. And as far as the approach, obviously, we see this here. So this is basically kind of an example or kind of a best practice, if you will, that you guys put together at Accenture in order to kind of, for organizations, when they look at DORA, this is what they, this is kind of the timeline or kind of the maturity journey that they have to go through. So it would be interesting to get your thoughts on how you see this, not just from a, kind of a top level understanding, but really de facto how organizations kind of use this as they see themselves moving on from from preparation to the actual testing all the way to closure and actually being compliant.
Yeah, I think now the many organizations are struggling on the details of RTS because are not really simple to understand. And as I mentioned before, they are still in under review in order to be finalized on these specific points. Second part is it's very important for the organization to have the capabilities to perform this type of this kind of test. I mean, organization capabilities, but also tools and processes. So you need to have in place everything that is required in order to perform the simulation once in 3 years, but you need to prepare. You cannot do without a preparation phase. As Accenture, we are supporting many clients in order to create this kind of capabilities and leveraging on the tools, on the platforms that they have in place, but they can also put on top of your cybersecurity, of their cybersecurity infrastructure to speed up, to empower this kind of exercise and simulations.
Makes perfect sense. And the closure part, basically, is that specifically to the TLPT or the actual testing, or is that just the reporting that comes in and kind of shows you the gaps or where and how you should be remediating or minimizing exposure?
Both part, also to the preparation phase, to the execution phase, and also to the report phase, obviously.
Excellent. And then here, obviously, what we see here in this diagram is kind of, as we've mentioned before, it's kind of the combination, the cross-team combination between the red team, the blue team. Obviously, it's, it's not something, it's not something that runs in a silo. It's kind of a cross-financial institution, cross teams collaboration and sort of, co-operated operation, obviously, which takes a fairly long amount of time, from the starting point all the way to becoming compliant. So
I think, sorry, Asaf, I think here it's the key, the main point is to support the financial service institution to industrialize this approach, because it's something that could be takes a lot of effort to put in place, and leveraging of on success stories of the big players to standardize the approach, to have an industrialized approach, and also leveraging of on something that could be automated in order to speed up this activity.
Absolutely, absolutely agreed. And again, so we're pretty much out of time, as far as that's related, and we've kind of reached the end of our presentation. So first of all, I really want to thank you, Matteo, for really providing a deep level of understanding of specifically of DORA. But we had multiple conversations, and obviously the things that you offer from an Accenture point of view go well beyond just DORA. So it would be interesting, as we start thinking or as we start wrapping up this whole idea. Obviously, what we have here on screen is, is a joint brief that we've put together, obviously with your help, with your kind help, in terms of reviewing and providing us some additional feedback on the basis of what we've seen in the presentation, kind of showing how you as a financial institution or a financial entity can really achieve the DORA compliance with a tool, just like Matteo mentioned, through automated security validation, and and that paper, that solution brief, really goes into the depth of the specific chapters, the articles, and really Pentera's approach as it relates to the various steps. But I want to kind of open it up to again, questions that that I had, and some other thoughts that I wanted to kind of share with you. So the first one is, we've spoken about this before. DORA has been spoken of, just like you said, for 23, or sorry, for 24 months already, since 2023. And I'm kind of wondering, can you share some success stories, or maybe potentially challenges that you've seen along the way with with either one or two examples of financial entities or institutions that are have really come far and have finalized this, or any others who are still struggling. I mean, you did mention that the RTS is still undergoing, and some of the technical requirements are still being finalized and underway. So your opinion or your view of the market would really give us a really good understanding of what's going on out there.
Yeah. We are working with many customers in order to support this kind of journey. I can share some specific situations where the customer has completed the assessment, and at the end of the assessment, it looks like that everything was already in place. So DORA is already done. We did not do nothing. So we are good, just to put in place TLPT, and we have done. Is not this is the situation, because looking the details of RTS, there are very specific, are very technically, they found that they have some gaps, so they need to come back to say, okay, not, it is not the way, we need to improve some capabilities, and we need to put in place some specific initiatives in order to reach the compliance. So this is one example, for example. In the other part, the other customer, for example, are, for example, starting from scratch, from some situation, for example, to the third-party risk management. They understood that this is not a point just of cybersecurity, but it's a risk of the entire company, the third party. So they are addressing these initiatives, not also leveraging on CISO department, but also including many functions of their organization in order to address a third-party risk management approach.
And is this also part of, so kind of, if I were to kind of go one layer deep, is this kind of a maturity of the company, or is this not necessarily depending on how security savvy or security oriented they are? I mean, if it's a smaller organization, do you see more challenges or less challenges versus, let's say, one of the bigger financial institutions in Europe, for example?
I think that small organizations, they have more things to do, but they are faster because they have
Red
less
tape.
complexity,
Yeah,
while the biggest one have some specific part to put in place, but having a high complexity
complicated.
environment, and they need to work hard to reach the compliance.
Understood. So you're saying it very much depends on, on the organization, on how mature they are, and how technical oriented the organization is. And another question that I had was, what other services or, kind of functions Accenture provides on top of, what we just kind of specifically spoken about?
Yeah, obviously as Accenture, we provide end-to-end services from consulting to technical services and the operations. Specifically with DORA, we support the client in the roadmap to understand which kind of gap they have and how to remediate, leveraging on their capabilities and infrastructure, but also on specifics chapter of the regulation. For example, TLPT, we can support to provide this kind of exercise. So we can support the client to manage, organize, and perform the TLPT assessment.
Interesting. Okay, that pretty much sums everything I had. So I think with that, we can pretty much, summarize today's session. So, as if I were to recap everything we've spoken about, DORA, what it is, what it means to a financial institution or entity in the EU, what are the timelines, what it means for them, what are the various chapters, and obviously, we've spoken about kind of the unique combination of, of what Pentera can provide from an automated security validation, or kind of a kind of that, if you will, that automation tool or that automation capability to really provide those needed capabilities that are pretty much, written in the regulations in terms of running, in across real production environments and at scale and a continuous basis, but also from a services standpoint, just like Matteo, excuse me, showed us in terms of the services, and kind of these two combined, make for a really powerful solution. So again, thank you very much, Matteo. Appreciate
Thank you.
your joining us, and thank you everyone else. Are we